Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you all for coming and making today what for me has been a lot of hard work, and hopefully I think has been delightful to see everybody again and to actually hold an in-person event after several years of not being able to do it. So it's really nice to see lots of faces, people chatting, people sharing news, people talking about groups. It's been fantastic to do. So I hope we can keep doing this sort of thing in future years. My talk is just going to be a few highlights from 2022-23 of the last year. It's really hard to pick out highlights. We have something in excess of 300,000 records added to our database in the last year. So picking out a handful to show today is not a simple task. So I haven't picked all of the rarest and most unusual things. I've picked a few of those, a few interesting things, a few things which have got nice pictures, a few things that tell a few stories about what's happening with wildlife. And I've covered all the different species groups, or a range of different species groups, so we just get a little flavour of each one. So I hope that will give you a little bit of a flavour of some of the fantastic wildlife we have here in southwest Scotland. This is a map. I had hoped to update this map. I confess I didn't have time to do this. This is a map of the records that came in via the online system called iRecord last year. I was hoping to bring it up to date with the stuff that's off my database this last week, but I've run out of time, so I've used the picture that I used in our newsletter at the end of the year. But it tells the story perfectly, and this gives you an idea of where the effort, if you like, and where the recording activity is particularly concentrated in Dumfries and Galloway. Now, this comes from the online iRecord system. I'll mention that again at the end. So it doesn't include things like bird track, which would swamp the number of records there just because we are an eBird, which are online bird watching record submission sites. But it does give you a picture of for generally where things are. So the darker the colour on that map shows, the more records have been recorded in that 5 kilometre square. And you can see that we have a cluster of a hotspot, if you like, up in the North Ayrshire region, and a cluster down a little bit in East Ayrshire, and a cluster down in Cucubrishire, the stewardship of Cucubrishire down the bottom, from Dumfries across to the sort of Gatehouse of Fleet area. That gives you a general idea of where the intensity of recording is greatest in D&G. There are other people sending records in to ourselves whose records don't feature on there, so I apologise for that. But it gives you a little bit of a picture of where is being covered and where isn't. And you can see that on there that there are gaps in the squares where we receive hardly any records, usually in more remote areas, more upland areas particularly, and all those which have got the palest colour on that map receive relatively few records each year. So even when you're out and about recording or watching and enjoying wildlife, don't forget that we don't always get as many records in some of these places where you might visit as you may think. So please feel free to send in records, even of common species, because it's always really welcomed. If we show a little chart here of which species groups were covered in that same iRecord data set. Now, iRecord obviously moths. If I had the bird records on here, they would swamp the moth records, which are the number one, which is the quadrant on the top right-hand side there. If I had added bird records from other sources, they would completely swamp that chart. But we only get a relatively small number of bird records coming in from iRecord, and in these other groups, the non-bird groups, generally, moths generate a lot of records, plants, which is the blue quadrant on the bottom right, and butterflies account for, well, those three groups account for over half of the records, of the other records that we receive each year. Few birds, and then probably just over about 30% of records covers all the other species put together. So, it's perhaps easy to forget that many of the smaller taxonomic groups, or the harder to see taxonomy, are represented in the records. So if you see, if you have a skill in any of those groups, records are ever more valuable. I'll start off with this species, which is a small skipper. Interesting species, and one which would be really welcome some records for this year. It's a butterfly, unusual for butterflies in that it looks rather moth-like in its appearance. But if we look at last year's records, we have quite a lot of records for Dumfries, squares covered for Dumfries and Galloway in the Cucubriccia and Dumfriesshire regions, not so many elsewhere. If I took that same map back 20 years, we would have barely a single dot on that map, perhaps just one when they were first found in the Lockerbie area, round about the foot and mouth disease time. And this is a species which has been spreading quite rapidly up the country. We started to get records away from that one site. There was a theory that maybe foot and mouth movements to do with the hay and things that we use for disposal of the foot and mouth carcasses might have contributed to the spread of that species and might have been a cause for it to be introduced into our region. But since then, if we look at the distribution map of small skipper, you can see it has been spreading of its own accord up the country, and now has a distribution which goes from eastwards and southwards from Newton Stewart to Edinburgh, with a few handful of dots elsewhere. This includes some unconfirmed records, so from this map from iRecord, so there's one or two of those loose dots on the outsides may not be confirmed records, but generally you get the picture that this is a species which has been spreading up the country. So definitely one to look out for if you're a Wigtonshire recorder or out in the Ayrshires. This is a species that may land on your doorstep in the next year or two, so keep an eye out. A nice story that's cropped up post-COVID pandemic. This species was found in Dumfries and Galloway during 2020. Rather nice to add a new species to our Dumfries and Galloway list. And it's pleasing to note that marsh fritillary is known from only a single site in Dumfries, and it has been monitored in years after, and it's been successfully found each year and seems to be doing well. It's a species that likes wet, dampish pastures, which seems that Dumfries and Galloway may well have quite a bit of suitable habitat. So you never know, we could have those turning up elsewhere again. So again, if you happen to be in that sort of habitat, flower-rich, damp pastures anywhere, you never know, keep your eyes peeled. Cousins of butterflies, we'll move on to the moths, and we had I've picked a few interesting finds from last year. Species on the left there, species of called shuttle-shaped dart. Not a specialist species, it seems to be quite ubiquitous in its food plants, so it's not highly specialized, but until recently it was quite a rare species. And again, like the small skipper, it seems to be having a bit of an expansion phase. Used to be a handful of records in Dumfries and Galloway. If you look back at the last atlas, just a few dots, that's all there was in our region, and none at all in Ayrshire. And then last year we had one day we had a new record coming up in Ayrshire of this species found, a new Vice County record, and by the end of the year there was half a dozen at several sites. So a species colonizing and moving into the region. So again, something that was perhaps a little scarcer, now moving northwards and moving westwards and colonizing new areas. The moth at the top right is called a northern drab. Bit of a misnomer really, because it's not particularly a northern species, and in my opinion, although its markings are rather subtle, it is rather a handsome moth. I wouldn't certainly describe it as drab. But this species, we had a new new county record for Dumfries and Galloway last year at the BioBlitz that we held at Tarras Valley Nature Reserve, the newly established nature reserve out in the Langham area. So delighted to find that in the spring counts there. Interesting that one of very, very few Scottish records previously was one from about 40 years previously, from on the other side of the border, in the borders, literally within sight of where we were recording. So probably gone undetected in the Taras Valley, Langham area for years, and we added it to our county list. And nice to know that this species, which is declining quite significantly nationally, has got a home in southwest Scotland. And then, of course, you get the odd interesting thing that's changed, and we get completely species that are completely new to Scotland. This one on the bottom right, a micromoth, is called English name is European corn borer. It can be a pest in some countries of maize crops, but not generally in the UK. Go back 50, 60, 70 years, this was a rare migrant, hardly ever occurred here in the UK at all, and then began to colonise southeast England in more recent years, and it's now made its way into Dumfries and Galloway, and first record for Scotland last year. So one of the beauties of moth trapping is that you never know quite what you might find in your trap, what new might turn up, or what species might be moving and changing in distribution. So I've always regarded moth trapping very much as it's like opening a presents on your birthday, because you never quite know what you're getting when you open your light trap. So enjoyable. If you ever get a chance, if you've never done moth trapping before and you get a chance to go to a public moth trapping session, would thoroughly recommend it. Sometimes you have to look a little bit more closely. This is also a moth, and this is the larvae of a moth spotted on a fallen leaf. This was spotted by one of our keen-eyed moth recorders, found a sycamore leaf and found the mine of the larvae of one of our small micro moths. So on the left-hand side, you can see the black line, which occupies the feeding channel of the larvae, which lives in between the surface of the leaf. So its eggs are laid underneath the leaf, and then it mines its way through the leaf throughout its life cycle. And the black line is the frass or droppings of the caterpillar as it goes along. So this was spotted on sycamore. Not many species mining sycamore, so Alison investigated and found out that this was a completely new species to Scotland, so rather excited to get a new addition to the list. Sometimes we don't always have to search for the records ourselves. They might sort of land and come to the right place, to the right person at the right time. Alistair, who's in the audience here, bought a Christmas tree, potted Christmas tree from Christmas Tree Farm at Cogunion, and a few days later noticed some aphids on his windowsill in his house. Now, most of us would probably have not noticed anything in particular about that, other than probably mopping them up or shooing them outside or whatever. But of course, Alistair, what that poor aphid didn't know is that Alistair studied this species group as his PhD many, many years ago. So he was able to find out that was, identify the species. He actually said this is a species species of the family that he was included in his PhD. And he never got to see this species when he was studying his PhD. But this is a species of aphid which lives on conifer stems, and probably occurs much more widely than we know, maybe in tree nurseries or in young plantations or whatever. But it landed at the right person at the right time, and we got a new species for Dumfries and Galloway because Alistair bought his Christmas tree at the right place. So always nice to get something unusual, an unusual find heading in the right direction. We've talked about some interesting finds. This one is a species which has found in Dumfries and Galloway, found a home in Dumfries and Galloway in recent years. Emperor dragonfly. The State of Dragonfly Review in 2021 showed that this species had expanded its range more than pretty much any other species of dragonfly in the UK. and Dumfries and Galloway had already getting quite a few records. And last year we got what I think is the first record in Ayrshire of this species. So if you're out on ponds in Ayrshire, this is certainly a species that you want to be looking out for. It's a large species, one of our largest dragonflies. The males are this lovely green and blue colour. Quite a distinctive dragonfly, common further south in England and sort of making its way up in Scotland. So one to certainly be looking out for this year. The birds are hard to mention, hard to pick highlights for because they're well recorded, and our local county bird reports do a good job on reporting how on our local finds. So, but I just mentioned, I can't skip by them completely, and I had this rather nice photograph posted by somebody. We had a little influx last autumn of black red start. This is a bird, robin-sized, slate grey on its back, rusty red tail. Might turn up on the coast, might equally turn up on an industrial estate, sit on a roof. Saw my first one, sat on Lady Scott's house at Slimbridge many moons ago. It just decided it was going to take residence for a week or two on Lady Scott's house at Slimbridge and just hopped around there for a week or two. That was my first one many moons ago. And they turn up every now and again, not very common in southwest Scotland. Yeah, a few last year, but you're just as likely to find one hopping around a suburban garden roof or somewhere on the coast path. So yeah, you never know when you might come across something that's interesting and out of the ordinary. From a mammal perspective, this is a species which is interesting. If you look in the books, look at the distribution of harvest mouse, and it'll show you that they don't really occur in Scotland. Slightly misleading in that they do occur in Scotland, albeit in rather small numbers, and are often overlooked. We have records in Dumfries and Galloway from not many recent ones at all. But you don't often get to see them like this, which is the adults. Out and about. What you're more likely to find are the signs. Signs like this, which it's the only species, mammal species, that makes a nest, an aerial nest above the ground, tied in between in long vegetation, like a tennis ball of woven grass vegetation. This is quite a distinctive sign. So if you happen to be surveying in that sort of any habitats where you might have tall grassland vegetation, never know. Keep your eyes open for a harvest mouse nest. They do occur. These are from 2 different sites up in Ayrshire last year. So a species probably occurs at low density and low numbers, and probably gets overlooked very easily in many habitats. Highlights a few aquatic finds. Great crested newt on the left, one of our protected species. Nice to get a new record in not very far away from here, up the Kendee Valley, of this. Quite often the finds that we get of this species, new sites, are not often breeding sites. We often get them found in people's gardens. They spend a lot of their life cycle in damp habitats, away from ponds. So they'd end up under logs, under dry stone dikes, and sometimes they will venture into people's gardens. That's quite often when people find them when they're gardening or something like that. But we often don't know where they breed, because the breeding ponds couldn't be up to maybe a kilometre or maybe 2 kilometres away. So that is often a question we have, is that quite often we have records of them being there, but not the site that they're actually breeding on. So again, but any records of those, always welcomed. Certainly something that we'd like more knowledge of, and is a species which for which Dumfries and Galloway is pretty important for, albeit, and in contrast, Ayrshire has virtually none of that species known from only a single site. Top right is a new to Scotland, found by one of our aquatic special recorders, I don't mean Bob, I don't mean you're aquatic in no nature, Bob, but you're just recording aquatic habitats. But water stick insect, new to Scotland, first confirmed record, always a nice find. Sometimes we find things that are less desirable, if you like. This is a non-native species found by Jim, who's also here today. Jim Logan found this American bladder snail, found in a fairly newly created pond. These sort of things, not very many records for Scotland, turn up probably because of movement of vegetation, maybe garden centre plants, or could be from something else. It's quite likely it happens all the time, and most people, and often goes undetected. But things, we all know that we all buy things from garden centres, whether it be for ponds or for our gardens, and that does cause things to move around. Things like flatworms get moved around with such things. So sometimes recording highlights some of those, the spread of species that are not native to our country, but are part of our human interventions in terms of how they travel around. We've already heard lots from our local botany groups, so I won't dwell other than to show a rather lovely photograph of this species, which is called Adderstong fern. It's a type of fern, very unusual for a fern, doesn't look very much like a fern at all, but it does have this rather wonderful spore-bearing spike that from which it gets its name. The tongue, if you like, that you can see in the center of the photograph. Not a common species, quite rare, found thanks to some good survey effort from the BSBI group and the county recorder last year at quite a few new sites, including some where they hadn't been recorded since Victorian times. So a bit of survey effort goes a long way in helping us to understand what species are doing and what species are in our area. So that's and perhaps gives us a bit more knowledge of something we thought we knew we didn't have very much about. So that's quite nice. Can't neglect the marine sightings. A couple of interesting things from Loch Ryan. One on the left is a rather intriguing, free-swimming sea slug. There's an English name of a Spanish dancer, and it propels itself in the water with this veil, if you like, and bounces up and down the water, which is how someone noticed it in the marina there. So that was a new find for the region, as was the non-native seaweed on the right, called oyster thief, a species of the Pacific in origin, probably introduced with Pacific oysters at some stage into Europe and has spread up the west coast of Britain. And this, as far as we're aware, is the first record in our region. So called because apparently at its mature stage, it grows and attaches on oysters, and it inflates. I believe it inflates and then floats off with an oyster. When it doesn't happen to do that in this country, but in its native region, apparently it eventually inflates and carries an oyster with it. So I read. I've never seen one. Finally, a few highlights from fungi. Fungi are diverse, come in all sorts of shapes, sizes and colours, and rather than try and pick rare ones, I've picked a couple of interesting ones, unusual habitats or unusual forms. The one on the left there is called horn stalkball. This was found very recently by my colleague at SWSEIC, Peter. At a walk, found an old skull with a horn attached, and looked closely, and on the skull, decomposing it, is this tiny fungal fruiting body all along the horn, and will be gathering its nutrients and weaving its way throughout the horn. So if you've happened to come across the rather sad discovery of a skull with a horn attached out in the hills, perhaps maybe give it a closer look. You never know, you might find something, a little bit of nature that you've never realized existed. Top right, rather delightful species called one of the earth star fungi, collared earth star, this one. Looks a little bit like a puffball that you may, or an earth ball that you may be familiar with, but this one gets the extra treatment of having a rather elegant tripod formed from the outer casing of the fungus, peeling back and lifting it above its surroundings, creating this star-shaped, elegant fruiting body. So this is found by Malcolm, who's probably here today as well. It's quite interesting. There's lots of people here finding all these nice things, which is always a nice thing to have. Bottom one there is nettle cluster cup. This is something that you might look, if you've got a patch of nettles in your garden, it's quite a common species. Later in the year, have a look, see if you find something that looks a bit like an orange caterpillar on the stem or on the leaf bases. And if you look closely, it's a set of little tiny fungal growths, clustered cup-like structures that form this, sometimes look like a caterpillar shaped. Rather elegant, bit unusual, but very common. Might be something you have even in your own garden, so something a little bit different to look out for. I'm going to finish off just by saying it's spring. This week we had the first orange tips recorded in the region, so perfect time to get out and about this weekend, have a look for some orange tips. Another week or two, maybe look out for orange tip eggs. If you can find some cuckoo flower, have a search around on cuckoo flower and see if you can find one of these tiny rugby balls, these orange rugby balls that are attached there. Within that, out of that will hatch a tiny, tiny orange larvae, which is that of an orange tip. So one to search for this spring. And this time of year, always good to get your first damselflies just on the wing this last week from online records. Haven't seen one yet. If you're at a pond anywhere, now's a good time. Get your spring dose of first dragonflies emerging. So enjoy those while you can. Final plug is just to mention the online recording site called iRecord. iRecord.org.uk will get you there. You can submit sightings online through there, attach photographs, put your details in. They'll go to national societies, they'll go to local record centres like ourselves, and makes for easy sharing of information. Of course, you can send records direct to ourselves or through our county recorder network, but if you want to do things online, this is an easy way of doing it. There will be some training days coming up this year. I know the Biosphere are probably doing some, we are probably doing some locally. So always chance if you want to learn how to use it, get in touch and keep an eye on our newsletter for further information. That's a little summary for the year, so thank you very much.
Thank you, Mark.
I'm going to zoom over and swap places. Back on technicals.
Next, we have two speakers talking about species on the edge. We have Liam Templeton and Jack Barton. I think they look like a double act, so I'm told. Liam is a Species on the Edge project officer for the Amphibian and Reptile Conservation Trust. Liam studied zoology at the University of Glasgow before going to a master's communication at the University School of Interdisciplinary Studies. Since then, he has worked on a number of community-oriented projects for various organisations, including the Scottish Wildlife Trust. Liam is particularly interested in the role of art and culture in communicating issues concerning the natural environment. I found out just today that he's an ex-Dumfries High School pupil, so that must be good, eh? So I always said teacher at Dumfries High School, sorry. that died. Okay. Jack Barton. Jack is a project officer for the RSPB, a role which he began in January. Jack studied zoology at the University of Exeter, graduation in 2018. Since then, he's worked across the UK, including on the Farne Islands, on Shetland counting seabirds for the National Seabird Census, and between travellings around the country, Jack spent much of his time in Dumfries and Galloway and has settled permanently in New Galloway in 2022. Although he's worked primarily with birds, Jack has a keen interest in all wildlife. So I'll pass over to them now. I think we've got a microphone issue. You okay?
Yeah.
Use this.
Oh,
Okay.
yeah.
To share.
Yeah.
Okay. Right, we're
I'll
mic'd up.
begin. Thanks very much, Colin, for that introduction. It was quite a pleasant surprise when
So I'll leave that here.
he introduced himself this morning, and I immediately recognised him as my former head teacher. I neglected to write in my CV that I was an alumni of Dumfries High School, but I would have included that as a matter of pride had I known that you would be introducing me. Thanks to Peter and Mark for inviting Jack and I to speak today. It's a great pleasure to be here and introduce you all to this exciting new project that we're very fortunate to be a part of. It's worth mentioning this early, the project's relatively early. It's a 4-year project. Jack and I both started around the end of January, so we don't yet have a lot of interesting observations to report on, but hopefully this presentation will give you a good overview of what we hope to achieve over the course of the next 4 years. So we'll start you off with just like a little bit of context for the project. As I'm sure many of you will be aware, fortunate as we are to live in such a beautiful part of the world, that Scotland's coasts and islands are amongst the most biodiverse areas in the UK, and they provide a lasting refuge for some of the most beautiful and unusual, but also vulnerable species. And I'm sure many of you will also be aware of this document that came out a few years ago, the State of Nature report, in which it more or less points out that a massive 49% of Scotland's species have declined in abundance since 1970, and 11% of species are critically endangered and therefore at risk of extinction in the British Isles. And that includes 13% of plants, 11% of fungi and lichens, and 37% of vertebrates and 5% of invertebrates, all of which are at risk of extinction in Great Britain. So what do we propose to do about that? So Species on the Edge was conceived as a coordinated approach. It is a partnership led by Nature Scot, including 7 environmental NGOs that more or less make up the Rethink Nature partnership, all of whom are dedicated to improving the fortunes of 37 priority species found along Scotland's coasts and islands. So as I mentioned before, we'll be delivering a 4-year programme of work aimed to tackle the impacts of environmental change on wildlife for the benefit of not just species, but also the people who and communities associated with these coastal and island areas. So yeah, as I said, our vision is to work together with local communities with an aim to secure and improve a future for coastal and island species in Scotland, form a support network between communities to safeguard these vulnerable species. So really building capacity, building skill and resilience amongst communities, and just making sure people have the necessary tools and knowledge to help build the databases, but also implement strategies to help to conserve them. As I mentioned before, it is a partnership project, so this is kind of an experiment. I suppose the hope is to strengthen this kind of partnership working and to promote that throughout the sector in Scotland and beyond. And really just to raise awareness of the importance of biodiversity in the Scottish context. So I mentioned it as a national project, so the areas that we're looking at specifically are landscapes hosting some of the rarest and most threatened species associated with coastal and island habitats. You can see those featured on the map there, including Argyll and Inner Hebrides, the east coast of Scotland, the north coast, the Orkney Isles, Outer Hebrides, Shetland Isles, and of course the Solway Firth, well, at least the Scottish side. So each of those areas have devised a unique plan of action which reflects and represents not only the biodiversity, but geography and socio-economic and cultural challenges associated with each of those areas in our approach. So moving on, we'll just zoom in on that Solway section, and we're going to give you a little bit of an overview of some of the target species that we'll be focusing on here in the Solway. So Jack's going to take over for the next few slides and just talk about some of those.
Thank you, Liam. Yeah, so obviously being from the RSPB, I'm going to start by talking about the bird species that we're going to be working on for the project. And one of those is the red-billed chough, a really charismatic bird, as I'm sure you all know. Unfortunately, we don't have red-billed chough in Dumfries and Galloway breeding at the moment. The last record was in 2008, the last sort of confirmed breeding attempt, 2008, 2009. Along the coastline. The chough is the UK's rarest corvid species, and in Scotland it seems to be declining at the moment, whereas in England choughs are doing quite well. So Isle of Man has a really good population, and down on the west coast as well, Pembrokeshire and Cornwall, they're doing really well. So there's lots of threats to chough in Scotland, so land use changes to farming practices, particularly agricultural intensification and abandonment. Chough really love feeding in dung, so they like firm, fibrous cowpats, and a nice sort of diverse pastoral coastal habitat. So as you can see on the map, there are a few yellow dots for Dumfries and Galloway. Those are sort of historic records, yeah, from sort of 2008, 2009, and there haven't really been any sightings of chough since. So the aims in this project for chough is to assess the habitat along the coast of Wigtonshire, to see what the suitability of the habitat is like there and see if there's more nesting sites. And then work with landowners along the coast there to help improve habitat for chough. Because the Isle of Man population is so close, the theory is that hopefully chough, if the habitat is improved, might move over in the future. And we're going to be putting out some chough shelters as well. Chough take really well to nest boxes, so that's one of the aims. The next bird species is the Greenland white-fronted goose. The Greenland white-fronted goose, obviously breeding in Greenland, migrating down to overwinter in Scotland. In Dumfries and Galloway, there's two populations, one around Loch Ken, which I'm sure many of you might have seen and heard about, obviously with the Galloway Glens project around the Greenland white-fronted geese there. But there's also another population near Stranraer at West Frew, but that population peaked about 25 years ago. It's about 680 birds back then, and over my lifetime, 25 years, there's been a 76% decline there. So now there's only about 160, 70 birds this year. So lots of different reasons for that. Declining productivity in their breeding areas is one reason, but there is evidence to show that if they're not going to their breeding areas in good condition from where they've been overwintering, then that's a factor in their decline. So the aims in this project, we're going to be monitoring the geese. There has been lots of good monitoring there already, but continuing that, and then feeding that back to the landowners in the area, because the connection with them hasn't been so good so far. A lot of them I've spoken to already can't identify a white-fronted goose or a pink-fronted goose, which they obviously will shoot at to deter because they eat lots of grass. So liaising with the landowners and hopefully leading to the development of future agri-environment schemes to help the geese. So those two species were part of the Farming Horizons aspect of the project. And then another aspect is called Turning the Tide. I hope you like the pun. I didn't come up with it myself. So that's based at the Wig on Loch Ryan, Kirkholm Point, which is in the top corner of Loch Ryan. And there used to be quite a few terns breeding there. Back in the Seabird 2000 count, there were 70 sandwich terns, 32 Arctic terns, and 10 common terns nesting on that spit. But unfortunately, they declined and they've gone extinct there. They don't breed there anymore, and that was thought to be due to the wash from the Stranraer ferries going in and out, washing and eroding the point there, so that the terns could no longer breed, and probably disturbance from dog walkers and the like as well in more recent years would have stopped terns returning. So the aims of this project, there's going to be a tern nesting platform. A tern nesting platform going in there to hopefully encourage the terns to go back. So yeah, it's just a sort of 10 by 10 meter raft with shingle on, which the terns will hopefully take to, and then obviously monitoring and surveying them down the line once that raft goes in, hopefully at the end of this year. And then we all know about the decline of farmland waders. You can see the catastrophic graphs there of lapwing at the top and curlew underneath. So the waders have been written into this project. Hopefully we'll be doing some work to help encourage wader populations. There are plans for new habitat creation at the RSPB Crookabal Dune Reserve, which is really exciting. More wetland habitat going in there. Which will definitely help with lapwings, curlews, snipe, redshank, for instance. So that would be really great. And then other creation of habitats, which will link in nicely to what Liam's going to be talking about next with the natterjack toads. So I'll pass to Liam.
Thanks for that, Jack. Yeah, so I mentioned partnership working. Another somewhat novel approach Species on the Edge hopes to explore is this idea of multi-taxa habitat management, so not managing specifically for any one species. And I think a lot of that comes from the fact that a lot of land managers were getting a bit fed up of being fed potentially contradictory information from one organization to the next. So hopefully through the process of this project, we'll discover sort of more effective ways to advise on land management strategies that don't benefit just one species, but biodiversity more broadly. So yeah, working for the amphibian and reptile conservation, one of my target species is the natterjack toad, which is known to be Scotland's rarest amphibian. It's also Europe's loudest amphibian, with calling males can be heard, I think, up to a mile away. So some of you may have been lucky enough to hear its iconic rasping. Although I've heard it can be commonly confused with the churring of a nightjar as well. So a little bit puzzling there. So in Dumfries and Galloway, historically, it was once known to be quite locally abundant, but unfortunately it's declined quite dramatically over the last few decades, and a lot of that is thought again to be associated with changes in land use and management practices, particularly with agriculture, but also with the development of certain leisure complexes, be it holiday parks, golf courses, things like that. But also we've seen the effects of climate change negatively impacting available habitat and breeding success of the natterjack toads, a lot of which is associated with rising sea levels and seasonal drought. The natterjack toad prefers what are known as ephemeral pools, so it relies on its pools drying up towards the end of the summer season, because it's what's known as a pioneer species. So it's very non-competitive with other amphibian species, particularly common toads, but also great crested newts. And with changes in available water, it can be quite unpredictable from one year to the next. So it's quite literally a species living on the edge in that regard. And yeah, despite its decline, there are a few strongholds still in the region. But these more or less exist as sort of satellite populations, and there's thought to be a great lack of intermixing between them to support a sort of healthy metapopulation. There was a mention earlier with regards to the golden eagles about genetic diversity, so having those populations linked up just as a way of supporting that. So in the context of our project, the aims could be described as just trying to have a better understanding of its existing population status and do a very thorough review of habitat quality and distribution, but also to engage with local communities and build skill and train volunteers to be able to participate in sort of structured monitoring programs, to work in partnership with landowners and managers to implement management best practices, and also to engage with members of the public to generally raise awareness of these threats and hopefully promote positive behaviours and attitudes. So I mentioned partnership working. The next few slides are some of the target species that we're hoping to contribute to the preservation of in partnership with some other species on the edge partners, the first of which is the northern brown argus, so working closely with Butterfly Conservation Scotland to not only monitor but improve habitat for this species. So its distribution has been noted to have declined by about 46% in Scotland since the mid-90s. It's typically found throughout northern England and Scotland, and threats include the loss and fragmentation of species-rich grassland habitat due to changes in grazing practices leading to successional vegetation like gorse and bracken invasion, but also inappropriate planting of woodland plantation, which is something that in this part of the world I think we're all too familiar with. So project conservation aims again is to survey known colonies and to assess their condition, to establish a more robust monitoring program, and to contribute to the restoration of habitat through scrub removal, and again liaise with landowners and communities to co-design sustainable management strategies. Next, we're working with the Bat Conservation Trust, looking at a range of species, including the common pipistrelle, the soprano pipistrelle, the Benton's bat, and the brown long-eared bat. Apologies, I didn't actually label the images on the right, but I think it goes from top left, bottom left, and then top right, bottom right, if I'm not mistaken. Bat Conservation Trust activities mainly focused in the Isle of Skye, but the diversity of habitat in mild climate and Dumfries and Galloway means that we have comparably quite diverse, rich area in this part of the world. So we're hoping to, I think they're somewhat under-recorded. So again, we're just hoping to promote the recording of these species, and hopefully working alongside the local bat group, who I had the pleasure to meet one of the representatives earlier this afternoon. I'm just going to skip ahead a little bit because we only got a few minutes left. But lastly, in partnership with Bug Life, we're going to be doing some work on the tadpole shrimp, which is a rather fascinating species. It's could accurately be described as a living fossil. It's widely reported as being the oldest known extinct animal species in the world. It's thought to be about 220 million years old without any extinction or evolution event. It's only known to occur at one other site in the UK, which is the New Forest in Hampshire. There were historical records from what in modern days RSPB Merse Head, but that population is thought to have been lost to sea incursion in around the 1960s, and then it was subsequently rediscovered near Carlaverick Wildfowl and Wetlands Trust in about 2010. Another really interesting thing about them is that their egg stage is able to exist in a stasis for decades and withstand all sorts of extremes of conditions. So you do sometimes find them popping up unexpectedly if the right conditions do occur. But that site at Carlaverick is also under threat of tidal inundation. So through this project, we're hoping to support a captive breeding program of this species, and then to create new receptor sites at Merse Head and undertake a translocation event subsequently. The translocated population will then be subsequently monitored by licensed professionals. I'm just going to switch back to Jack. Thank you.
So all of those species, of course, very species focused project, but there are going to be some secondary beneficiaries for that, and some of them listed here. So working with the butterfly, of course, if surveyors are out and about, other species to look out for, such as forester moth and dingy skipper and grayling as well. And then obviously other waders, which might benefit from the pool creations, and great crested newt, adder. So lots of other species will hopefully benefit from this project, other than the ones we've mentioned. So quite a diverse plan, as well as all the landowner engagement and the species monitoring, and hopefully increasing those populations. Other main outcomes is building a volunteer base, which I'll say a tiny bit more about in a second, and raising the species profile both locally and nationally as part of the bigger project. So really exciting 4 years ahead, I should think. So I'd just like to say there is a great opportunity to volunteer with us. So with the RSPB, with ARC, with Butterfly Conservation for this project. So the more tech savvy amongst you and those of you at home, you're able to scan that QR code and it will take you to a volunteer sign up sheet, and that will enable us to get your details so we can contact you if you're interested in helping out. So some opportunities include the Chuff survey and habitat assessment. I've been out a lot this week doing that. Farmland wader surveys, butterfly monitoring for the northern brown argus. There's lots of sites that Butterfly Conservation want to get monitored for the rock rose, the food plant of the butterfly. Natterjack toad monitoring and practical conservation days. So I'll leave that QR code up there in a second.
See that we have physical.
Yeah, we have physical sheets as well for those of you. Just come and find us, and you can fill out a form, and we'll get back in touch with you. Thanks very much.
Thanks, guys. We'll just get back here. Ooh. Thanks for that. Now we move to another species in the age, actually, and that's willow tits, and Gavin Chambers is going to speak to us about that. Gavin's been with the RSPB warden at the Galloway Reserves. He's been at the Wood of Cree, Kendy Marshes, Mull of Galloway since the late 2020s. Having started his RSP career at Lake Vyrnwy in mid-Wales, recently Gavin took on the RSPB position of species lead for willow tit, having developed an interest in the species in Wales and now in Dumfries and Galloway. He grew up in Minnegaff, and from the age of 8, his interest in wildlife, particularly birds, flourished. He's delighted to be actually working in the area. And as on Thursday, as the bird group drove into Minnegaff, an osprey flew across the road. I braked really hard. The group saw it, but the driver behind was not pleased. She was sitting in the back of my car. Gavin, over to you. Okay, remove this stuff. There goes up.
So I believe willow tit was a species on the edge, essentially down in England, with the Back from the Brink project. So it tells you how much of a kind of declining species it is. But I'm going to start going the right way. We can start with a bit of a game, just to sort of learn a few facts, a bit of top trumps. And I thought, well, what species shall I go up against the willow tit? And there's only really one main bird species we talked about today already. So I thought we'd try it with the golden eagle and see how we get on. So I thought I'd start with the length for the bird. So built a tail. I think it's probably fairly obvious, but we'll get the scales right a bit more, slightly better. But that's, I believe that's a bit more representative. It's about, I think it's about 8 times bigger, the golden eagle, from bill to tail. So number of eggs. Willow tit, 6 to 8. I think we've already kind of heard how many golden eagle has. It might be 2 eggs maximum. So I'll take a win for the willow tits on that one. UK population. So we got about 2,750 in 2016, but I'll come back to that because of the national survey that's taken place. Things are sort of getting a better idea. Golden eagles, I believe that might be right, someone might correct me, but that's from the BTO population. So I'll take another win, there we go. Distribution change, so how wide an area are they populated and how much is that kind of constricted or got bigger? Willow-tit, they've sadly gone down 55%, whereas golden eagle, they're on the up, as we've heard this morning. So we'll give one to golden eagle. So I think that's 2-all. I think that's how it works. And what have we learned from it? Maybe not a great deal, but willow-tits are not doing great distribution-wise, and I'll get back to the population. So the willow-tit, I decided it may be a bit like the northern drab that Mark was talking about. It's quite a kind of elegant bird, but the colours aren't there to kind of get you that interested. But it's a smart little bird that you don't really see it too often because it's quite elusive. Identification-wise, it's about the size of a blue tit, maybe a little bit smaller. The white pale wing bar is traditionally being used as a feature to look for. The black cap, it hasn't got the white crest like a coal tit would have. The main confusion species is marsh tit. We don't have marsh tit in Dumfries and Galloway. However, there has been talk of a sighting over in the borders, near the Dumfries and Galloway border. So it is a species now to be aware of, certainly on the east side of the region. And mainly the call is the best way, call and song is the best way to separate them. I didn't think it was worth going into the detail of them on this. It's also worth knowing that our willow-tit in Britain is different to what they got in Europe. It's a subspecies. I'm not going to try and pronounce it, but that is a subspecies. So if we lose the willow-tit from the UK, we've lost a complete subspecies. It's not just part of it that might be recolonised from Europe. So it's an important one we want to look after. This is what you can often get when you go out doing the surveys, maybe not the blue sky, but a singing willow-tit. And if it works, you might be able to hear some of it. So that's kind of the call, quite nasally sound. A contact call and or an alarm call. The high pitch is the singing, and that's quite often what you might get. And then for anyone who's been doing willow-tit surveys in the national survey or else other times with playback, that's probably a sound just kind of sick of now because it's you play it constantly through March and April and it's just stuck in your head. So this is the kind of habitat that we might find willow-tit. This is at Kendy Marshes. So the whole of Loch Ken has really nice pockets of wet woodland. These are sort of willows. You can see how wet it is. Loch Ken fluctuates in water levels, so it floods it and makes it less desirable for certain tree species to grow. The willow-tits love willows, surprisingly, but other sort of hazels and birch, alder, a good mix. And then as you go more into the habitat, so this is the Wood of Cree. So along the River Cree area, the floodplain, we've got a nice mix of vegetation there, different tree species. But it's all very scrubby and quite dense, and that's what the willow-tit really like. I had the pleasure yesterday morning, well, it wasn't pleasurable taking the American skunk cabbage out, but while I was there, I did have a pair of willow-tits come past. And it's amazing just to watch them scurrying around, nitpicking at all these little mossy patches, looking for insects, looking for any food they can find. And you see top right, there's a sort of a dead branch sticking out covered in moss. That's the ideal place where the willow-tits might nest. Typically, say 10 centimetres, 20 centimetres in diameter, but they require dead, rotting wood to be able to excavate their hole, their nest. So a bit like a mini woodpecker, they've got to do that. Here's two kind of examples, both from this year. The left-hand picture is in quite an old hawthorn tree. and it's probably about head height, that hole. It's not actually dug down yet, but they've excavated the hole and found it's probably quite a suitable material to go into. I'll be monitoring that one to see if they do end up using it. On the right, you can see the hole below, so I believe that's this year's excavation. But on top is an old nest, so that I believe is probably last year's nest. There's still a bit of nesting material in there, and there were some egg fragments when I had a closer look. But you can see that the top of the stump has essentially broken off at some point, and because there's eggshells, it's probably happened before they got chicks, etc. And it just shows how vulnerable those kind of nests are. It's rotting timber. If it gets really wet and soggy, it's just going to fall over. If you walk past that, a deer, a sheep, anything, just gives it a bit of a knock, it could fall over. So they're just really vulnerable to nest failure, along with predation. A woodpecker would easily just sort of go into that if it found it. And we do also know that blue tits will happily take over a nest. So willow tit makes the nest, and then a blue tit finds it and thinks, well, I'll have that one instead. And it just makes it a lot harder for willow tit to find the next suitable stump. And in certain territories, you can find multiple starts of nests. So you can imagine the amount of energy they've taken to actually get around. This is one of the active nests from last year. So this is at RSPB Kenmure Homes at New Galloway. It's right in that middle stump, near the top on the right, below that, what looks like a white patch. And hopefully this is just show you roughly what they're up to. I think it came in with a caterpillar on that occasion. But having been back to the site this year, that stump is already on the ground. So it just shows again how vulnerable that would have been last year. So what did we know? This is before we did the national survey. So as I said, 2,750 pairs. That's a decline of 94% since the late 60s. And then the distribution is restricted by about 55%. The graph at the bottom just shows roughly how the numbers have changed. But it's important to note all this data is from BBS squares, Atlas work. It's not been a specific survey looking at willow tits, and certainly not with playback. So it kind of definitely shows that it should be red listed. And it's the fastest declining resident species we have in the UK. It's second after turtle dove when you add all the migratory species in well. So you can tell just how much bad time it's having in the UK at the moment. So it's decided we better find out exactly what we've got left in the UK, where they are, how many we've got. So RSPB led the survey back in 2019 is when it started. It ran for 3 years. We were supported by the other organisations mentioned there. The surveys themselves were taken place by volunteers. So there could be willow tit study groups around the UK, bird clubs, bird recorders, other organisations, Wildlife Trust, etc. As I say, playback survey was the methodology used, and that's playing a tape and getting a willow tit to respond to you. It's because it's so secretive. You just walk through their habitat, you rarely find them or disturb them. So you play a tape for 2 minutes, listen for 2 minutes, record your findings. Over the UK, 1,900 tetrads were surveyed. And as I say, it was over 3 years, but it was affected badly by that word we don't use too often. So the results of the national survey. So the results are on the right on the map, and the left hand is kind of the data we had before the survey. If we start with the left hand map, you can see down in the southeast that a lot of the black, like the black triangles, but anyway, the black area is where the birds were lost from and they're no longer there. The middle bit is they're all present throughout, all the bird atlases have taken place, and red as they've gained in those areas. So you can clearly see that there's been a restriction in an area from the southeast. And then looking at the data we got from the national survey, you can see exactly that there are no birds sort of virtually in the southeast now. And there's more of a band from the southwest, from Cornwall, through Wales, through the Midlands, up through Manchester, Wigan area, and then up to Durham and into Newcastle. And it's also interesting to note that our population in Dumfries and Galloway, which is the only kind of Scottish population, there's a bit of a gap between other populations. So there has been talk of the gene pool and things like that. So are we in the kind of area that we're just going to have an isolated population that are going to have problems? It's hard to, there's obviously a bit of a hillious, mountainous region in between the two areas. But the birds are sedentary, so they don't move around too much from where they're nesting. And I should say, so the red dots are where they were found, and the blue dots are where they weren't found on the actual survey. And you can see hotspots. I believe one of the hotspots in Wales was one keen volunteer who just went out and blitzed the area. So these are the numbers. So that in the UK, almost 5,700. In England, it's 76%. Wales is 21%. And Scotland is 3%, which is made up of mostly Dumfries and Galloway, with 2 territories in Ayrshire. You'll see that that population is a lot higher than what I quoted earlier. But that's mainly because it's a completely different survey. So we can't kind of compare like for like. This survey has never taken place before. The playback method is far more reliable than all the other BBS surveys. So we're kind of confident that we're not finding everything, but we're finding more than what we would have done before. So zooming in on our area, we've got sort of, you can quite easily tell that we're basically in the Nice Valley, where Willow Tits are in the Loch Ken, from Freve Castle area in the south, up past Kendy Marshes, and then up to the top end we got Kenmure Homes as well, and then just up to Dalry. So that's where we kind of got a good population. You can kind of see as you drive up the valley, it's got that nice wet habitat on the edge of the loch. Got a Woodhall Loch nearby as well. And then just for sort of reference, you've got Woodacree in the west and Castle Loch, Loch Maben in the east. So they're sort of 2 sites where they've traditionally always been. I understand this around the Woodacree that potentially had been 12 territories at one point, but now we're kind of more down to four territories. The habitat kind of has changed in certain areas. Partly the oak woodland is matured, whereas when it had been felled earlier, it would have been a lot younger and scrubbier, so they like that. So there's various different reasons why populations will have changed. I was just going to point out a couple of sites. So this site had obviously been surveyed but didn't find any birds, and that's Carscowan Moss near Wigtown. I remember seeing Willow Tits there, and it can't be that long ago because my memory's so bad. So it's just showing again that there weren't birds recorded then, but it doesn't mean they're not there because they may have been missed. They are hard birds to find. And then I pointed out Claverock NNR. I know they are in the wood at kind of Castle Wood. So again, I don't think it was perhaps not surveyed at all, but therefore the population estimate is using a lot of statistics as well to understand what we've got. And I can't neglect Ayrshire. So they've got, in the survey, had 2 pairs in the Dalmellington, Bogton Loch area. And then I believe there was a sighting over again in the borders for the first time in 15 years, which perhaps is a bit closer to marsh tit to make all things a bit confusing now, but it was a reliable observer, so it'd be interesting to see if that starts to develop as well. And then over in the west, you kind of got these isolated sites, and you just wonder how many more of those isolated sites where we still have got birds, but just need to be found. So the issues, constraints, quite often it's the woodland just matures too much, and the tall trees, they prefer woodland up to say 4 meters in height at different range levels as well. So the scrubbiness they require. Drying out of woodlands, so either they've been drainaged or just kind of the climate change is going to start making things dry out a bit more. Could make places wetter as well, but they like that. The tree species that favour the wet woodland is what the Willow Tits like. Connectivity, so we might have a really nice valley of Loch Ken, so they can move up and down that area, but once you get to somewhere else, they're just going to be isolated in their little bit of habitat. So improving those connectivity areas would be good. the amount of dead wood, tidying up a dead wood, rotting timber, it's sort of, that's what they require to breed. So if you haven't got that, they're just not going to nest at all. Overgrazing, again, it's just limiting the scrub that's in your woodland. And then competition and predation, which I've already mentioned. So what can we do about it? So this is, again, the wood acree. Typically, the habitat may do it naturally. So this is a wind-blow tree. It's opened up. It'll then allow new shoots to come out and make it more scrubby. We may go in there and do some more artificial, so felling or pulling over trees to open up where it's become a bit too mature. Coppicing is a typical management tool for willow tit. Do it in areas, do it in, and then there's kind of making sure the woodland stays wet as well, whether it's sort of seasonal or constant pools. I think the insect life is improved by having the water as well. So it's just lots of things we can do. But I think it's also important to mention that there's a lot of projects and experiments going on to find out why are willow tits declining, and we don't know what the one key issue is yet to then kind of aim at that and make that change. So we're still trying to work out what that is. I've sort of touched on it slightly, but have we found all of them? Do we know where they all are in, say, our region in Dumfries and Galloway? Are there any pockets of population we don't really know about yet? So going back to our area, I sort of thought I'd put a few areas that seem to have not, there might be a combination of they weren't surveyed in the survey. There's sort of different habitat. You think the Galloway Forest Park is between New Galloway and Newton Stewart. I know my time in Wales, it was a lot of conifer plantations down there, but willow tits seem to be associated with those areas. Certainly where you got the riparian areas where they weren't planting conifers, that was allowed to scrub up, so willow tits were around. A clear fell, that comes quite scrubby early on, so willow tits moved into those areas. So are there anywhere in the Galloway Forest Park and other forest areas that actually they are about? And then again, are they towards Dunrar? Are they between us and Dalmellington? It feels like there could be a lot more areas they could be in. But I think one of the key things is to make sure your sightings count. So if you are seeing them, is to record them somewhere. BTO Bird Track is perhaps the best place to put your bird sightings, and as much detail as possible. So whether it's a singing bird, a calling bird. There are other places I record eBird or direct to the bird recorder. You may have also heard of the people called SWSEIC, which I managed to forget off my list of people to send to, but if you'd like to send them to them, I'll happily take it as well. And also, not necessarily in this area, but bottom right is the willow tit with colour rings on it. As you go around the UK, there's various projects around the UK, and all sightings from anywhere in the UK are really important, whether they've got rings on or not, but you may come across them with rings, and that would be really key to those projects to understand their movements. It'd be quite perhaps amazing if we did suddenly get a colour ring one in the area. They have done some in North Cumbria, so there's always a chance on the east side that they might pop up. And that bird was from Lake Vyrnwy when I was down in Wales. All the other pictures that I've shown have been from Dumfries and Galloway. I think I might be doing it early and having a cup of coffee. Yeah, so if anyone here is interested in willow tits and wants to contact me, if you think you've got them in your area that maybe wasn't on the map, I'd be really interested to hear from you, or if you've got projects that you're setting out to do things on willow tit, it'd just be interesting to sort of understand what is going on in this area. So yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you, Gavin. Before you salivate over a coffee, there's questions. So same, there's more questions. All right, okay. So as before, we will just take the microphone around the audience if required. You put your hand up. And also, I've asked the respondents here to stand up when they answer, please, because I believe the last time folks back couldn't hear. Okay, off you go, sir. I'll do these first. Right, I've got one here from Jim Galbraith. All right, I'm not sure it's aimed at. Is there a negative effect from bird feeders sighted near territories? Is that you, Gavin?
Yeah.
Do you do bird feeders?
Yeah, so I know there's been various, well, there has been a paper written about feeders and willow tits. And I think the idea, the theory is that having feeders near a territory, you're attracting more competition. So your blue tits, grey tits, coal tits. So you're increasing a species that might have an influence on how the willow tit gets on. So whether it's the blue tit taking over the nest or an increased tit population that we're going to feed on the food and the insects around. So yeah, it's one of those things that's still being kind of looked at and thought about. And we kind of need to make that decision at some point that willow tits live in an area where you typically don't get your other tits. So the more you increase those tits and they go into that area, the harder it is potentially for the willow tits to live.
Okay. Right, Gavin? Oh.
We were just going to ask if there is any facility on the iRecord to, ID things, because we quite often find insects, moths, and we just don't know what they are.
Oh,
I'll answer that one. I'll answer
that you can.
I'll try and take that one. The iRecord app does have some help with ID. I wouldn't tend to use it as the primary source. However, there's a separate app. Our favourite one is an app which is available on Android and on Apple iOS. Is called OBS Identify, OBS Identify, all one word. There is a similar thing on iRecord, but having used both, I think Peter's used both as well with me, and I think we both agree that we sort of prefer OBS Identify at present. Now, OBS Identify is an app. It's actually built by a Dutch organisation which is the Dutch version of iRecord, which is the British thing. But at the moment, they've been doing it a bit longer than iRecord have. So you can take a photograph of a species, open the app, pick your species from your gallery or take it from the app itself and ask it to say what it thinks it is. Now, by all means, it is not 100% correct, so don't wholly rely on it. However, if we've found it's very reliable at giving you a clue towards what type of species or what family and often even which particular species it is. So it gives you a confidence how sure it thinks it is. Now, obviously, it's only trained on what it knows, so it's better on some species groups than others. But if you're a beginner and want to get some help, sometimes the books can be rather daunting on giving you a clue for things and looking things up. Or if you want to go online and find some information about the possibilities, it's a good starting point. And the technology now, being able to use AI effectively to use for assistance with image identification, and the quality of images you get from modern mobile phones means it's getting better all the time. Just bear in mind that there are many species groups, particularly some of the smaller invertebrate groups, that you simply can't be 100% sure of from photographs in many cases. So bear that in mind, but it can be a very helpful tool to get you in the right direction.
Thanks. We've got another question here.
Quick question for Jack, if I may. On the subject of choughs, can you think of any particular reason why there should be such a healthy population on the Isle of Man, in contrast to complete absence on the Wigtonshire coast, for instance?
Yeah, sure. I'm not entirely. I haven't been to the Isle of Man, so I can't answer that specifically. And I haven't had much sort of interaction with them yet. But I think the farming systems over there are less intensive, probably. And there's probably a greater availability of nesting habitat as well. I know there's the Manx Chough project as well that's run in the past. So they've provided a lot of nest boxes for chough, and there's been a lot of sort of targeted conservation work for them there. So those will be a few of the reasons.
Sorry, time is creeping on here, so I want to suggest, because it's now coffee time, if people have questions, they can actually bring them directly to the speakers, if they could, please. and then we can now go for coffee and be back here at... Okay, last but definitely not least is Peter Norman. Peter is the Projects Officer for SWSEIC since 2018, working with partners and communities to collect wildlife information. Before that, for 20 years, he was a Biodiversity Officer for Dumfries and Galloway, and he also worked at the Ranger for the National Trust as a volunteer interested in researching local landscape history, recording all wildlife, especially moths, fungi and birds. I will also take questions straight after in the normal way when the microphone gets to you. Peter.
Thanks, Colin. Good afternoon. I've got the graveyard slot. I'm also going to make a couple of apologies because the presentation I'm going to be showing about wild mammals at home, some of you have heard before because I've given it before, and I know some of you in the room were present, and Mark has also given part of it before. So if you've heard it before, apologies, but I'll try and say something different this time. So this is about a project which I was involved in leading. It was due to start in 2019, and never got started because of you know what. And hoped then to be finished in 2020 or 2021. And eventually got finished in 2022. So it was hoped to be a one-year project and turned into a 3 and a bit year project. Here we go, right. The project was funded by Galloway Glens Landscape Partnership, who you heard about this morning. And the red line that you can see on the map there is the Galloway Glens area. The project involved loaning out trail cameras and a bat detector. And the squares that you can see on the map there are the 1 kilometre squares where we loaned out those pieces of equipment. As you can see, we managed to squeeze one in that wasn't in the Galloway Glens area. There are 19 1 kilometre squares, which in biological recording terms is how we record wildlife. But the number of sites was actually greater than that. Some sites, in fact, in New Galloway, there were 3 sites that were all within the same 1 kilometre square. Conversely, there's a couple of sites were actually extended over more than 1 kilometre square. So if I mention sites and I mention squares, there is a slight difference between the two. I'm not going to mention specific sites because most of the specific sites were in people's gardens. And I don't want to give away the privacy of where their garden is, but I certainly will talk about squares. Oh, we're going the wrong way. So that's the pieces of equipment that we loaned out. Trail cameras and a static bat recorder. The trail cameras are triggered by movement of animals in front of them to switch on, and then they record either still images or video images. We tended to record video images mostly. They also work at night, so that when it's dark, they have infrared sensors on them so they can pick up animals moving around at night as well. And we, as part of the project, had about 750, more than 750 video clips. And there isn't any easy way to analyze them. I had to watch all 750 video clips, most of them 3 or 4 times, just to check that there weren't any mammals on them. Quite a lot of them didn't have mammals on them, but quite a lot of them did. The bat recorder, we only had 1 bat recorder because it's quite an expensive piece of kit, but we tend to put that out just for 1 or 2 nights. The cameras can go out for sort of 3 or 4 or 5 weeks at a time, but the bat recorder only goes out for 1 or 2 nights and records every bat that flies past it. So you can get thousands of recordings, get hundreds of recordings in a single night. And in total, we had about 9,000 sound recordings as a result of the project. Fortunately, we've got some software, which I'll show you about later on, which is able to automatically analyze those recordings. I didn't have to listen to 9,000 bat recordings. But there's a number of species we picked up which weren't the target of the project, but we still recorded them anyway. And the most obvious one of those is birds. We recorded 37 to 38 bird species. The reason that there's slight uncertainty about absolutely how many is down at the bottom, willow warbler and chiffchaff. When we got videos of willow warbler and chiffchaff, we couldn't actually tell the difference. It was one or the other. The most common species was blackbird, but all the rest of the top 10 were basically what you'd expect in gardens. Most of these sites were going out in gardens. We had 2 out on farms, and we had 2 out in community woodlands, but all the rest of them were out in private gardens. So the birds were pretty much as expected, really. In terms of the bats, again, there's a range of species, 5 to 11 species, because, as I said, the software enables you to automatically identify them, but it's not 100% accurate. So the nocturnal liceless bat, we know that we recorded noctules and liceless, and we think we recorded noctules and liceless. We think we recorded both of them, but it's very difficult sometimes to be sure of absolutely which one it is. And also with the myotis species bats, Daubentons, Natteras, whiskered, brants, those are very difficult to tell apart on the bat recorder. So we definitely had some of them, but how many of them remains to be seen. We're actually going to get some of those particular recordings sent away and professionally analysed, so that we will know from people who are much more expert than I am which ones of those species we had. But at the moment, we just think that we know we had some of them. We might have had them all. Similarly with the species at the bottom, the rare species, Narthusius pipistrelle, Alcathor bat, it's possible that we had both of those species as well, but we won't know until we get them professionally analysed. The bat recording software told us that we had lots of Alcathor bats. They come up quite commonly as the identification on the software, but we don't trust the software, so we're going to get a human to have a look at it. The ones that we definitely do know about, soprano pipistrelle was the most commonly recorded. Of all the sites where we had a bat detector out, soprano pipistrelle was the commonest bat at all but one of them. And that one site, the commonest bat, was common pipistrelle. But nearly all, in fact, all the sites had both of them. It's just a different mix between which ones were commonest and which ones were least common. Mostly soprano common, mostly common pipistrelle less common, despite its name. Brown long-eared bat, we only recorded on a few sites because it's really strictly a woodland species of bat, but we did have confirmed recordings of brown long-eared bat. This is just an example of what the software shows you in terms of a bat recording. This is just one example from New Galloway in August 2022. Just on one night, there was 1,477 recordings, and those recordings contained 13,065 individual calls. The next two charts below that, the first one shows you at what time of the night most of the calls were recorded. So you can see lots of the blue bars between about 9 o'clock and 12:30 in the morning, lots of activity then. But after that, in this particular example, very little activity. That's an unusual chart for one night of recording. Normally we get lots of activity At dusk, not lots of activity at dusk, and then lots of activity at dawn again, and a quiet bit in the middle. But for some reason, this site was different. The next chart actually shows you the frequency that is most commonly recorded. And in this particular example, the highest bars are between 55 and 60 kilohertz, which is already suggesting that's a soprano pipistrelle. Well, that's the most common species that was recorded there, soprano pipistrelle. The chart also shows frequency of recordings around about the 15 to 20 kilohertz range. You would think they may be nocturnal or liceless bats that tend to call at those low frequencies. But you do have to be careful, because pipistrelles, both soprano pipistrelle and to a lesser extent common pipistrelle, will call at 50, 60 kilohertz whilst they're hunting insects, but they have social contact calls at much lower frequency. So some of those lower frequency might actually be pipistrelle bats. And the bottom recording is actually a single recording. Ignore the fact that it says it's in Switzerland. That's because the bat recording machine was made in Switzerland, and I haven't bothered actually changing. If you change it, you have to look up the latitude and longitude of every site you look at. And I knew the sites where I was at, so I didn't bother changing it. So ignore that bit. Recording quality 99%. Recording length 3.57 seconds. And in that time, there was 18 calls. And the chart actually shows you all 18 calls. And it also gives you a little symbol of the call shape. And each bat has a distinctive call shape. And below that, it tells you the peak frequency. They call through a range of frequencies, but the peak frequency, 56.3 kilohertz. And from all of that data, the machine and the humans are able to work out that this was Pipistrellus pygmaeus soprano pipistrelle. So that's just one example of a bat recording. The rest of the project was involving the trail cameras, and we recorded 16 to 18 species on the trail cameras. And this is the top 8. The most common one by far was roe deer, but also in the top 10, red fox, wood mouse, badger, rabbit, hedgehog, red squirrel, and then lower down, brown rat, water shrew, unidentified vole. We think it was both a field vole and a bank vole, but we cannot be 100% certain. I think we've probably got one of each. And then other species, otter, brown hare, pine marten, mink, grey squirrel, and unidentified shrews. That's either a pygmy shrew or a common shrew. And they're really difficult to tell apart, even when you've got one in your hand. So on a trail camera, it's just about impossible to tell them apart. But there's a few species which we'd hoped to get, and we didn't get. So stoats and weasels are probably the obvious two, which we know are in the area because other people have recorded them. And some of the gardens where we put the trail cameras out, the owners of those gardens had said they'd seen stoats and weasels, but we never managed to get any footage of any of them. The other ones, there's more concrete reasons why we didn't manage to get footage of them. Polecat ferret is not very common in the area. Indeed, if we have any genuine polecats. Mole is pretty common in the area, but we didn't put any cameras underground, so we didn't get any footage of moles. Waterfowl would have been fantastic to get, and we do have records of them in the area, and we did put cameras deliberately on watercourses in the hope we'd get them, but we weren't lucky enough. We did get a brown rat, which I tried very hard to turn into a waterfowl, but it was a brown rat. House mouse might surprise you because lots of you get mice in your house. but nearly all the mice that appear in houses in Galloway are wood mice and not house mice. House mice are quite rare in Dumfries and Galloway. We do have records of them, but not many records of them. Red and fallow deer tend not to visit the gardens and the sort of areas where we're putting cameras. Wild boar, introduced wild boar. One of the sites, one of the community woodlands, there was lots of evidence of wild boar. So we put the cameras directly to catch footage of wild boar, and we didn't get any, but we tried. There's a few other species that we almost missed. Putting trail cameras out is not a science, it's an art. And you tend to have to put your head into the mind of the animal that you're trying to get footage of. And that's not very easy. So particularly at the beginning of the project, we put cameras in places, we thought this would be a great place, we'll get some great footage here, and we didn't. And this is just a few examples in this video of places where we thought we'd get good footage, and we did get footage, but only just. Let's just continue going. Obviously at SWSEIC, we're keen to get records of anything, and we put them into our database, which is now over 3 million species, and they're used for an enormous range of different things. But one of the things we can do with them is actually show distribution maps of local species. So this is a distribution map of badger records, and the yellow squares that you can see on there were the new records that came about as a result of the project. And the amazing thing about the project is that every mammal that we had on a trail camera at every location was a new record, was a record of that species in an area where we previously had no records of that species. So it's just really fortunate it worked out like that. But the blue squares on this map are actually the existing records that we had previous to the project. And there's an obvious feature of this map which stands out. This is a map of badger records. Anybody who knows the roads in Dumfries and Galloway will work out that the natural habitat of badgers is roads. And of course, the natural habitat of badgers is not roads, but the natural habitat that people record badgers, dead badgers, is roads. So our existing records of badgers are along the road network. So it was really good in this project to actually get some footage and some records of real, live, living badgers rather than dead ones by the side of the road. These are some other maps, and the same thing applies. The yellow dots are the new records, and the blue dots, the blue squares, are the existing ones. These show you a little bit about the distribution of mammals, but they also show you a lot about the distribution of mammal recorders. And the otter looks to be pretty widespread in Dumfries and Galloway. And the reason for that is there was a national otter survey carried out over several years by Jim and Rosemary Green, who are just over the border in Ayrshire. And they deliberately went out and looked for signs of otters at systematically squares spread across the region. And lo and behold, they found evidence of otters at just about all the squares across the region. So the distribution of otters, according to that map, is not actually the distribution of otters, it's the distribution of where Jim and Rosemary went to look for otters and found them. Water shrews are probably quite a common animal in Dumfries and Galloway, but if you look at the map, you wouldn't think so. And the reason being is that they tend to be nocturnal. If we can get the videos playing, I'll actually show you some video footage of some of them. They're nocturnal, they're very difficult to see, and they're pretty difficult to identify as well. not quite as hard as the common and pygmy shrews, but you could still easily mistake them for one of those other species. So we don't have many records of water shrew. And in the Galloway Glens area, we got 2 new records of water shrew, and that was to be added to the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 previous records that we had. So that was quite an achievement. Grey squirrel, red squirrel, the record are quite well recorded. So the people sending in records probably do give quite a good, accurate distribution of the actual animals. And you can see both of them tend to be up the river valleys. And that happens to be just because that's where all the woodland is. The grey squirrel map, if I'd shown you this map 20 years ago, there would have been hardly any grey squirrels on it. The red squirrel map probably wouldn't have been that different. But it's interesting to think, if we repeat this project in 20 years, how will those maps have changed? I suspect, I hope I'm wrong, but I suspect that the red squirrel will be a lot less commonly widespread across the region, and the grey squirrel will be much more widely spread across the region. Almost the 2 maps could be reversed in 20 years' time. I hope I'm wrong about that. We recorded both native species and non-native species. So we recorded rabbits, which have been here since Norman times. And there were, if you had rabbits on your land, you were very lucky in Norman times. They were a prized resource. That's obviously not the case today. Brown rats have probably been here for about 200 years, replacing black rats. Grey squirrels, again, have been here for about 150 years. And mink have been here since about the 1930s. But we also recorded red squirrels and pine martens, both of which are native species, but the animals actually found in Dumfries and Galloway are both introduced. Red squirrels were probably introduced from the Carlisle area about 1850 and have spread across the region. And hopefully that spread continues in the future. Pine martens probably died out in Dumfries and Galloway, and probably all the pine martens that we have now in Dumfries and Galloway were introduced, 15 animals were introduced in the 1970s in 2 locations, Glentrue and Clattering Shores. And we think, but we haven't done the DNA analysis to know for sure, we think that all the pine marten population that we have in the region now is descended from those 15 introduced animals. See if this one plays. Roe deer. Show you how things can go wrong sometimes. This was a camera set and a badger set. But we did get badgers on other occasions, badger crossing a burn. Fox, obviously noticing the camera, stops and has a look back. A couple of hedgehogs feeding under a bird table. And if you look on the left-hand side briefly, there's a wood mouse. A rabbit, this is up near Carspain, and the person who owns the garden at Carspain says that the black rabbits have been there for years and years, so it's obviously a genetic thing. Hops away. Pine marten, this is near Dalry. The owner of the garden was putting food out and he thought that pine martens, he's fairly sure in fact that pine martens were visiting. This is the same garden, probably the same pine marten. And it was coming very regularly to this garden. Red squirrels, 2 red squirrels chasing each other. There you go again. But the owner of this site, who's here today, is putting out food for them and they're taking advantage of the food.
Did you have a hair trap on that?
We didn't have a hair trap on it, no. See, this one's in the winter, it's got its hair tops. But we also got footage of what we didn't want, but we expected we would get grey squirrels. This is a brown rat. It's not the one I was trying to turn into a waterfall, but brown rats are probably much more common than people think along watercourses. It's not necessarily the case that you've got a problem if you've got brown rats living nearby you. Another introduced species, a mink. There's one mink, there's two mink. There's three mink. During, well, early morning, hopping along, but same three mink going back again at night. Now there is a theory that you don't get mink and otters on the same site. But the next video is exactly the same camera, exactly the same site, two otters. And one of them likes the camera so much it gives it a kiss before it leaves. There we go. While you're on that one, Mark, just go back to, we'll do the video that we didn't watch earlier on. Which was the outtakes. These are the ones that we didn't quite manage to get. So this was a camera set on a badger, a camera set on a badger set. We didn't get any badgers, but we got badger steam. Rabbit ears. It's good that rabbits have got big ears, we can recognize them. Roe deer back and roe deer antlers, you'll see shortly. Again, we could identify the species and we could sex the species. The wrong sort of mammal. This was a badger set as well. And the wrong sort of mammal licking the camera. Now, if we go back to where we were. Nope. We're both pressing at the same time. The purpose of the project was to record presence or absence of mammals. But it's impossible when you're watching all these videos not to notice things about animal behavior as well. So we're looking at things like reaction of the animals to the camera. The second one, coping with adverse weather. The cameras were out during Storm Arwen. Now, I can't actually show you any footage from that time because the camera was doing this. And it wouldn't be pleasant to watch. But as far as the mammals were concerned, these just seemed to continue oblivious to the fact that there was a storm raging all around them. Other behavior was interaction with other animals. And you tend to notice when you're looking at video after video after video that similar mammals move differently through the same habitat. So the next series of videos, if Mark can get them up, mammals at home behavior, just shows a few, before we started, Mark, just shows a few examples of, just pause that for a second. Just shows a few examples of mammal behavior, but the reason I've asked Mark to pause it just now is that I've got to give you a warning in advance that there's not this one, but there's another roe deer on here, which just sprints straight across in front of the camera. And the way the cameras work is that they trigger movement. But the mammal is going so fast that the camera wouldn't be able to capture it. So how did we manage to get a roe deer sprinting across? The only thing we can think of is that there was two roe deer sprinting across. The first one triggered the camera and the second one was filmed. So that's one thing to look at really briefly on here. The second thing to look at before you start it, Mark, is there's a water shrew on here. And the water shrew also moves fairly fast, but is moving in the water, and it's very difficult to separate out from the water. This is why I've got to watch the videos 2 or 3 times. So I'll tell you when he comes up, but you have to look very closely, very quickly to catch it when it comes up. So we'll begin with a different roe deer, which stood in front of the camera and was obviously completely oblivious to the camera. Unlike this badger, which is in a wood near Kakubri, which knew that there was something there that wasn't there last night. And it's looking and it's sniffing. Of course, at night, when the camera's recording infrared, it has a light on it. This is a fox, and we've got dozens of photographs of a fox moving from left to right, obviously going somewhere. We've only got one video of the fox going in the opposite direction. So what was going on there? Who knows?
Circular route.
There's the roe deer sprinting across. This is not the water shrew. This is a wood mouse. This is another wood mouse. And wood mice operate on the burn completely differently to the water shrew. They're using the stones, the stepping stones, hopping from one to the other. But the next video is the water shrew. It doesn't do any hopping, it just goes down the water. Did you see it? This is mammal behaviour with other animals. Obviously, it's a brown hare and a magpie, and the two of them completely ignore each other. It's as if the other one wasn't there. They've even got the backs turned to each other there. This is a hedgehog going behind someone's garden fence, and a few seconds later, the local cat. The local cat didn't follow the hedgehog, so I think the hedgehog was okay in this case. He's a roe deer, and if you look in the distance, you've got two eyes. This is another cat. The two of them are walking towards each other. Suddenly, they see each other. What happens is, the cat gives the roe deer a wide berth. This is a fox having a quick pee. And the next morning, a few hours later, the local dog comes along. Who's been here? Who's been in my garden? I'll give that a pee as well. So just a reminder, in terms of mammals, their world is largely a world of smell rather than sight. So, in summary, the project was about getting people involved in mammals, putting the cameras in their gardens, showing them footage of things that they'd never seen before, or things that we'd never seen before. But it's important to remember that all these species, all these animals, are sharing exactly the same environment as us. And yet, we tend not to see them very often. Some of them have got even closer links with people. Some of the species I've shown here have been deliberately or accidentally introduced or reintroduced by humans. Some species have taken advantage of deliberate or accidental human activity. Putting feed out for them is an obvious deliberate action, and the animals have taken advantage of that. But basically, all of the habitat and all of the food supply is very much modified by humans, whether it's planting trees, creating gardens, diverting streams or whatever. Humans have an impact on the environment everywhere, and the animals everywhere are adapting, mostly successfully, to that human-dominated environment. But the last little video that I'm going to finish off with shows that some of them haven't quite mastered the technique yet. And this is a badger, which wasn't in the Galloway Glens area, but did come about as a result of someone in the Galloway Glens area telling us about it. This is a Kipford. This is a badger taking advantage of some food that has been put out. Hasn't quite mastered the technique though, as you'll see. Okay, that's me. Thank you.
Fantastic. Any questions for Peter? Gobsmacked.
Nope, I can go home.
Oh, sorry. Have we got a microphone running? Oh, it's beside me. All right. I would have walked. Anyway.
Jack.
So the map of the water shrew is quite sparse, and are there other ways of recording them apart from camera traps?
Yes, but the other ways require quite a lot of expertise as well. The commonest way that recorded is in owl pellets, dissecting owl pellets that are eating water shrews or any other shrews or mice, and you know what you're looking at. You can distinguish water shrew from other shrews. I'm not an expert myself, so I couldn't actually tell you what the diagnostic features are, but it is possible to distinguish them from owl pellets.
Any more questions? Oh, there is. Needs the exercise, it's okay.
Clearly.
Thanks very much. Yeah, very interesting and lovely pictures. Nice to see the pine martens. I was wondering if you had any update of roughly how many are in the region these days. Do we know that?
Yeah, I think the short answer to that is no. I've personally never seen a pine marten, never seen a live Parkman. I've now filmed the one, but I wasn't there when the film was taken. As I said, they were probably introduced in the 1970s from 15 animals. And we have records, Mark might know better than me, we have records in our database all across the region, so they're certainly spread all across the region. But how many we've got is anybody's guess, I think. There is some research that's been carried out by Johnny Burks in the Galloway Forest Park. I'm not privileged to his research, but it's possible that he might have a better idea than we have on regards numbers and distribution.
just to say, numbers wise, I don't know, but there was Nature Scott also did some work surveying using dogs, trained dogs as well, doing surveys, and it has shown there's quite a big spread away from the Galloway Forest Park area, and they're now much more widespread than they certainly used to be, which is great news at least.
It's possible as well that there was some animals here which never went extinct. There was a population in Cumbria which managed to hang on when they went extinct in most of the rest of Britain, and it's possible that some animals from Cumbria have colonised Dumfries and Galloway, but it's also possible that there was a few animals in Dumfries and Galloway that went undetected for decades, and those are what we're seeing now. In order to be sure, well, I don't think we ever will be sure, because we were needed to do the DNA of the 15 animals released, and then to do the DNA of animals that we're finding today. So we probably won't know the answer to that.
Thanks. I was just going to add to that. We've been in touch with Stephanie. Now I can't remember her surname, but she's part of the. Yes, that's right.
Yep.
And there have been confirmed sightings of pine martens as far over as nearly Drumore and Liswalt area, and we're hoping to host one of the boxes in the not too distant future where we are. So yeah, there are sightings over our neck of the woods too.
Thank you for reminding me. I should have said that there is now a pine marten group that Stephanie organises. We did ask Stephanie to come and give a presentation today about it, but Stephanie's really busy at the moment, so she wasn't able to. But yeah, hopefully the pine marten group will be discovering more and more information about them.
Hi there. Do I take it from what you've been saying that you want records of road casualties? You know, the carnage on the roads is really bad.
Yeah.
We'd all agree on that, but do you want all those records?
Yes.
If we can identify them?
Yes. If you can identify what's left of them, yes, we do want records of those. As I say, it's nicer to get records of live living animals, but the records of dead road casualties are important as well, not only because they help the overall distribution map, but they can use our data and Amy, who managed the A75, which has the worst record of any road in Scotland for road mammal casualties, Amy could use our data to actually do things to their road. It's difficult to put underpasses in after the road's built, but if they're doing a new bit of road, they can put an underpass in and actually help the terrible situation which we currently have. So in answer to your question, yes, we do want any road casualty information. And just to extend that question a bit wider, anybody in the room who wants to ask a question, would you like a record of whatever? The answer is yes. We'll take a record of anything, anywhere.
Quick question for both of you. You've got two clusters of species, water vole, otter and mink. Water vole, otter and mink, and red and grey squirrel. And it seems to me that the two images you had of the red and the grey squirrels, there was a lot of overlap. And you maintained that the reds are probably where they were previously. But I would contend that some of those places that were not recording red squirrels now previously had them, and that the greys have pushed them out. And equally, it's possible that mink have been pushed out by otters and water voles have been pushed out by mink. Have you done any time series analysis yet?
I mean, there is a fascinating series of projects there. The main purpose of SWSEIC is to record data and make that data available. So if anybody wants to do a master's project, you're welcome to use our data, but we don't have the time or the expertise, it must be said, to do a lot of those sort of analysis ourselves.
Great, thanks for that. Thank you very much indeed, Peter, that was super. When you said about wild mammals at home, I was thinking that we had two, but they've left home now. This is the chat. We're now going to have to say goodbye to our online attendees, and thank you very much for joining us today. And also, if you have any feedback, we would welcome it massively. But thank you for being with us, and goodbye.